Okay, and away we go. So we are here to talk with you today about the linguistics of SLP practice so that we can help you apply what you know to signed languages. Our thought for how we'll address this topic is that most, if not all, SLP programs in their training prepare you to assess and assist related to the auditory method, to speech disorders, to swallowing disorders, and the like, and working with clients in that regard. I suspect many of you, either by choice or by happenstance, are here because you work with deaf and hard of hearing children, not assessing their swallowing disorders and other concerns of the like, but you're working with a population who use sign language to communicate. And so your programs may or may not have best prepared you to do so. You have the knowledge, the skills, the abilities, and we're hoping here to help you leverage what you already have in your skill set to apply that to your work with this unique population. That's our goal for today. We've got some accidental animations. Apologies for the that aspect of our slide. So let me actually skip past the table of contents and get right into our disclosures. I will skip those animations altogether. You will, of course, at the end of this presentation, receive the slides, and you are welcome to dive into them further. We are required to share with you our disclosures. First of all, I am a Sacramento State employee, and I do earn a salary there. I also am provided an honorarium here. Razi, same for him. Works for Sacramento State, also an employee in the San Juan Unified School District, and also receiving a Speak In honorarium from Language First. You can also see a number of organizations that we are members of. Oh, and I see a question from the chat. The slides have not yet been shared with our participants. Either Kim or Laura will disperse those after the webinar. So you'll receive them after the close of our session today. We have 3 learning outcomes that we hope you're able to attain today. The first of which is to compare and contrast aspects of linguistics between the signed and oral modalities. The second is to help you determine appropriate treatment goals and activities to address identified areas of need. And thirdly, to describe appropriate treatment activities to address identified goals. Now, how we intend to do this, let me just bear with me for a moment. I'll give you a sense of how we'll approach this. Now, I know that you have probably attended linguistics seminars in the past, and you've likely just scratched the surface. The theoretical frameworks, and we're hoping to give you a better sense of exactly what that looks like in a more nuanced way, at which point Razi will talk to you about the application of it. So I'll set the foundation, then Razi will help us to unpack that and bring it to life in your everyday practice. Laura has already introduced us, and so we don't need to run through this slide a bit more, but that is us in a nutshell. This is a quote from the director of the Visual Language and Visual Learning Center at Gallaudet University, Dr. Laura Ann Petito. She says that the more language exposure, the better. The brain does not discriminate. It accepts both sound and sign. Now, the reason that we start with this quote is because it's likely that you have noticed yourselves that there are many SLPs in our field who are interested to work in support of deaf and hard of hearing children, and yet there's still something in the back of their minds, sort of in the unconscious, that the spoken modality is better. And we're not here to accuse. There's no blame game at all within our presentation. The goal here is instead to give you what your training may have lacked. All of our understanding, of course, dates back to the programs from where we graduate. Many of us have been conditioned to think that one modality is superior to the other, but the truth is that they are one and the same. It's possible that there is some unlearning of these biases that needs to happen from what our graduate instructors imbued in us and what it looks like with your clinical practice. And so we invite you to come along in that journey of unlearning. I'll start here with the domains of linguistic structure. To get us started, we'll dive right into phonology. Just a brief anecdote, I can't help myself, before we focus on this slide here. A story I heard about the sign that we use to produce phonology was actually borrowed from British Sign Language. Now, the reason that we sign it in that way is because the index finger in the non-dominant hand represents sign, and the dominant dynamic hand represents the formational parameters that we use for referring to these component pieces of language. And so that's one helpful way to break down the sign that we use for signed phonology. So again, the definition here is the study of component pieces of language, how they combine, how they change in different contexts, and how they're organized. For oral languages, phonology is the study of sound patterns, rules, and sound combinations. And what it is that we invite you to think differently about, that phonology is not just for oral languages, that it's actually the study of the pieces of language, how they're ordered, how they combine, how they are put together to create their syntax. Now, for oral languages, again, those sound patterns and those pieces are needed to create contrast, right? And so we need minimal pairs, like bat and pat, for example. Everything is the same except that first sound that is uttered. And so therefore we know the difference between ba and pa will indicate a difference in meaning. They create a minimal pair through that contrast. Now, for signed languages, phonology is the study of formational parameters. If you'll remember back to the production of that sign borrowed from BSL, including the rules of parameter combinations, and which parameters create phonemic contrasts. Again, contrasts. Now, I'm sure that many of you have seen examples like apple and onion, right? Whereas everything is the same, each parameter is the same, except for one we modify, which is location. By the chin or by the eye, then determines the meaning and shows us by that one change, there's contrast here, which creates this minimal pair and difference in meaning. A little bit more here about phonology. For oral languages, consonants are characterized by a number of features that I'm sure you could all render off in your sleep with your eyes closed and backwards: place, manner, and voicing. Now, whereas vowels are characterized by the tongue's positionality, whether it's fore or aft, and the height at which it is in the mouth, right? And so we have that for our oral languages. We compare that and have a look here at sign languages to see what is the same and where it differs, is that signs themselves are characterized by periods of stasis, otherwise known as a lack of movement, and periods of transition. Now, the period of stasis are also what we refer to as hold, where the hands are not moving. They're practically static, I should say. You'd really have to slow down a video rendering of that sign where you could identify that static hold. For many signs, it's a brief moment, but you'll just have to take my word that after hours and hours and hours of assessment, these periods of stasis are in fact present and serve a purpose. So holds tend to represent more consonants. If you think of that, the parallel between oral and signed languages, consonants as a hold is almost like creates some sort of resistance in the mouth production, right? There's a stop of airflow, and once you release the airflow, that is then what creates the sound. We know this. Well, there is that period of buildup where there is no external air being produced. There's that sort of transition. Well, surprise, we also refer to them as transitions, these movement periods in signed languages. And that's more parallel to the vowel production in oral languages. Vowels tend to be a bit longer in their oral production, and the purpose that they serve in signed languages tends to be longer in their signed production too. It may seem that there is no movement, but the truth is that it is there. Similar to consonants, there's a bit longer, but vowels there is a hold, it just happens to be shorter. There, now, the animation is here for this slide with a purpose. Trust me, it's not accidental like with our table of contents. Many of you know the structure of syllables for oral languages. This will be familiar to you. We have the onset, we have the nucleus, we have the coda. And depending on exactly what your training has looked like and what it's prepared you to do, depending on your undergraduate studies as well before you entered your SLP programs, you may also know that languages vary when it comes to when and where the onset is allowed and when and where the coda is or is not allowed. There are complicated nuances and such around codas themselves. However, this is the basic structure that we are going to use for the syllable breakdown of oral languages. Now, again, that nucleus is that movement. That's the peak of movement where it's the most recognizable part of sound where we're able to attend. Now, as we contrast that with phonology and syllables in sign languages, here's an idea of what it could look like. Now, I'll describe to you the 3 different syllable structure as we have them initialized here. This is not an exhaustive tree. I think that the field itself is still novel and discovering more and more, though these are some of the most common. So the first would be the hold or location, the movement, and then the location. So for example here, of course, now here I am ready to give you one impromptu, and what have I got? Bear with me. We'll come back to this in just a moment. I'll give you an exemplar. But let us, in the meantime, look at another syllabic structure, which is very similar, or excuse me, rather very common, where there is one location required for production, and that the sign structure here is what we refer to as the path of movement. Okay, so the movement path, for example, how I'm producing the sign that means fine, there is an important movement that is represented by that dominant hand. There's no external movement here. The movement is only happening in the hand itself that it's producing. So here, let's contrast that with candle or mother, right? Or something that could mean, oh, that's cool, that's really interesting. That's going to show you that external movement. Another very common structure that we see in sign language is based on the first structure, and it's duplicated. Now here, however, you will notice that instead of having 3 times 2 of these segments, we actually have 7. The reason for that is that you can't have 2 periods of stasis together. There has to be something in between them to break them up and to create that transition from one to the next. So that's why you'll see 7 different segments in total. Number of different signs fall into this category: school, mom, backpack, the way that I'm producing them here, and the list goes on. I'm still trying to think, Razi, maybe you can help me with an example for that first one, our first tree here.
Sorry.
Fair enough. I'm sure that the moment that we disconnect, an entire dictionary or thesaurus is going to pop up in our minds, right? So in 3 hours, I'll be ready for you. That said, though, for phonology, let's move on to morphology, the next level of our discourse. We sign it like so. I've also seen another sign, a couple of different options that we use to indicate morphology, which is the study of how words are formed and what parts or what components are required to build that morpheme. Now, when we look into morphology, we see that there's a consistent form and meaning pairing. Okay. For each morpheme, we know the word that it builds because of its form meaning pairing. And when it is connected in such a way, it will mean the same. As babies are acquiring language, this is what they're deciphering. As they're adding new concepts into their lexicon, and maybe for those of you who are learning second or other languages as adults, this is also the process of the discernment process that your brains will go through. As a baby hears or sees the same word, the same sign again and again within a particular context, this will create that form meaning pair for them, by which they'll then file that into their lexicon as something they understand of how to both receive and to express, to produce by sign, by speech, whatever it may be. So it's a very active process, actually, that the brain goes through to create these more meaning form pairs. For us today, we're going to look into two main types of morphological processes, one of which is derivational. And the way we sign it actually indicates its meaning itself, its definition, that it causes the word to change grammatical class and or significantly alters the meaning. Like, for example, making one change to create an antonym. So we sign it in this very particular way because we take the origin with our non-dominant index finger and we pull from it and create something new with our dominant dynamic hand. Inflectional morphology, on the other hand, we sign this way. It is an initialized sign. We could spend some hours talking about opinions about that another time, but we sign it in this way because it refers to the change from a word to fit a particular context. It's not a great change, such as derivational, but it is significant enough that it modifies the word to fit again within this context. And some samples or some examples of derivational morphology and inflectional morphology are what our next slides are going to show. Okay, I know that this slide is a bit busy, so I'll give you just a moment to have a look at it and then we'll unpack it together. Okay, let's take the second column, oral languages, for starters. We've got inflectional, which include tense, pluralizers, the possessive, indicators of comparison, and superlatives. For sign languages, inflectional morphology would include agreement, verbs, and locative verbs. For derivational morphology in oral languages, that includes our nominalizers, words that create nouns. For example, you'll see here on the screen, adverbial indications, which would take one word and create an adverb, and adjectival words, which with the addition of these suffixes, for example, would create an adjective. In sign languages, we have for derivational morphology, noun-verb pairs, negative incorporation, negation, and numeral incorporation. If these don't quite make sense, I assure you that within 5 minutes or so, you'll be on board. So give us a moment, we'll go through each of these. Let's start here with some inflectional morphology, and we'll show you what agreement verbs look like. I'm not going to give you examples of oral languages because, again, we assume that that is the background that folks are bringing to this presentation today. And so we want to compare and contrast that which you're familiar with what may be novel for you. So in sign languages and the studies of sign languages, they show that there are types of structure across the world that can, where we can study the linguistics of each. But for our purposes today, we are only focusing on ASL. So orientation tells us the subject and the object of the word. Of the phrase. And so if we wanted to show, for example, that I am bawling someone out, I would do so directionally. I am the person conducting the act, so therefore I am the subject. And the direction to which I sign to bawl out is the unlucky recipient of the bawling out. If I'm the one in trouble, however, it's a verb that can be modified and its directionality changed to show then that orientation. That palm orientation shows who is doing and who is receiving. Again, the directionality of the verb. Another example you see here is to inform. You can inform from yourself to someone else or others or someone else to you. The same is true for send, ignore, and tell. It depends on who the subject is and who the object is in the clause or in the phrase that we would move this verb, the orientation and or the movement itself, in a very specific way to indicate who is doing and who is being affected by the verb. Next, we have locative verbs. This is a verb class where they do not indicate who is doing what to whom. Rather, they tell you where an object is moving in space. Or they tell you something else about the object and its relationship to the location. So if I move from one side to another, then I know that simply by the use of space, something is going from point A to point B. That use of different locations is what gives us that meaning. Or if I indicate a referent that is out of my natural signing space, maybe I'm pointing into the backyard of my parents' home or where it may be in my narrative, I do need to show that it is in a space that's beyond where we are right now. And also the sign to leave alone, that means to leave alone, for example. This verb is going to reflect where. Who is it that is leaving whom alone? Is it in the same room? Is it in this referential space that we have created in our signed utterance? Or is it something that is beyond our proximal referent point that we can both share? Okay, wanted to make sure that I had this slide here. Now, for inflectional morphology agreement verbs, just as a recap, indicate who is involved. They don't, however, show us where the action happened, whereas locative verbs are those that tell us where something happened, where something moved to, but they don't tell us who did the moving and from whom to it went, or rather to whom it went. For deaf and hard of hearing children who are struggling to utter all of the information in an entire sentence. Many of you may actually work with some students and clients who fit this. You want to ask them more and more about the who did what to whom and in what manner. You can't just ask them who hit whom, but some of this information may actually be implied or rather inherent in the verb itself. And so it can't be made discrete. So for example, if a child came up to you and said, that teacher bawled me out, to borrow that sign we just used, you know that that student doesn't need to say me as a separate sign, because the directional verb itself indicates, based on how they've signed it, that this teacher did this action to them. It's all packed into one. It's actually much more, it's not linear in the way that English is required to be. The preposition is packed within, right? That's sort of the same idea. It's all in one utterance or in one production. With locative verbs, however, you do still need to include the subject and the object, right? By sign name, by some sort of indicator of who it is we're talking about, because otherwise we only know the location from one point to the next, but we don't know who's involved. Earlier I was freezing and now it's changed, I'm a bit warm now, okay. Now, on to derivational morphology. I mentioned previously these noun-verb pairs, and we do have a few that are on the slide. So for example, sit, to sit down, versus chair. How it is that we render the verb, versus the noun, what I'm expecting you to know or to have already known, or maybe this is new, I don't know, and it will help you start to see it everywhere, is that verbs tend to be produced a bit longer than, or take a bit longer to produce than their noun pair. So to sit, for example, the movement is a little bit longer. So that would go back to our LML, one location. Then we have the M, the movement, and it ends in one location, right? So that's an example, to tell someone to sit down. There are many verbs that do have that structure. And that particular verb happens to have a noun pair. If that is the case, there will be 2 syllables in those 7 segments that we would use to render it. So here, to sit has the one LML syllable, but chair actually has 2 movements that are repeated and required in a shorter fashion to indicate its noun, that it is a noun rather. So that's an example of a noun-verb pair. Another would be to join, the verb to join versus participant. Excuse me, to participate, apologies. Develop versus development. So to develop versus development would be another. The reason that this is a derivational morpheme is because it does change the part of speech or the lexical class, would be another term that we would refer to it, of what it is changing. Another type of derivational morpheme is those, or what would include those that can create antonyms. For example, to know versus don't know, right? That movement, that palm orientation indicates the difference, that antonym. And just by adding that negation, we see that the 2 are discrete. To like versus not to like, to want versus to not want. The way that we create this negation, or a negation involved, is adding new information to create its class. Also, with derivational morphology, we've got some additional slides that we'll look at with the numerical systems. So for age, from age 1 to age 9, they share the same movement. And today we won't be going into that too much further for the specific numerical systems, but note that the years and the way that we include numbers can, for example, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, up to 9, also will look the same, but already unpack, or rather pack within it quite a bit of meaning just based on the number that we use. Such is the case with how many years ago, how many years in the past, how many number of weeks are we talking about? Is it 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks? Exact same production. The only parameter that has changed is the hand shape, which indicates a different length of time. All right, how's everyone doing? Let's check in. Any questions so far? Okay, all right, we'll move ahead. The next level of our discourse structure that we'll discuss here today is syntax. Syntax is the arrangement of words and phrases that create well-formed sentences in a language. Some languages have much more flexible syntactical structures, and others are more strict in their ordering. for creating what is understood to be a grammatical sentence. In those more strict languages, if you were to apply a flexible approach to it, it wouldn't make sense. It would be incoherent for speakers or users of that language. So this is important for your students and clients to learn, that all the information we produce has a structure by which it needs to follow to be comprehensible and grammatical. Now, some types of word order, for example, basic word order, which would be the most common or least restricted word order in a particular language. This is just, again, not an exhaustive list. This is some types of word order. But for basic word order, if you think about languages that do have flexible syntax, they will still have a basic word order by which all users of the language will subscribe. We would know that it is basic because children will be able to acquire it earlier. And there will be standards, it'll be common within that language, and it'll be common within other languages, also that basic word order. And I just had it. What was the fourth one I was about to share? Yes, they're able to use it in the most contexts, right? There's very little limit about how it is that you refer to things, where and how you emphasize. Any context can be appropriate for the use of this basic word order. Now, noun adjective word orders would be the ordering of nouns and adjectives. Which is it that comes first, right? The noun followed by the adjective, or the adjective followed by the noun. Another type of word order you'll find within syntax is negation, right? In what order does the negation follow? Does it precede the verb or does it not? Does it come after the fact? And in adding the negation, does it affect only the verb, or does the entire clause then get negated by its insertion? There are different rules that dictate how and when it's appropriate to use. Now, depending on your students and their individual goals, you may need to consider what parts of the language they are struggling to produce themselves. If, for example, they are not sure how to insert negatives and where to do so appropriately, then you can really hone in your therapy to target what will most help them in acquiring their syntax of their language, right? And so there are commonalities that we see within our populations, but I'm not an SLP, so I couldn't say this for sure. I would take a gander, though, that many of you are seeing clients and students struggling with basic word order. And of course, that being the most significant foundation to lay, especially within our language deprived population, you will see them struggle with the creation and understanding of this basic word order. All right. Now, moving into some aspects of linguistics that only apply to the signed modality. Thus far, we have compared and contrasted the structures between the oral languages and signed languages to understand the parallels, what they share, where they differ. And now we're going to dive solely into that signed modality. So you won't see the oral modality here. And in our forthcoming slides, we'll talk about what makes the signed modality unique. So here we talk about, again, the modality-specific characteristics, the first of which is paired articulators. Okay, so again, I had briefly mentioned that the mouth's production is one articulator, right? Again, in the oral, apologies, I didn't actually say it in this presentation. Razi and I co-taught a class this morning and we were focused on it there. Thank you, Razi, for reminding me. Here I am conflating the two. Apologies. So allow me to take a few steps back. Now, with oral languages, you needn't pay attention to the tongue's positionality because there's one tongue, right? But when we have a sign language where there are two hands rendering meaning, we do need to attend to which hand is responsible for the action in two-handed signs. Are both hands required to produce the same hand shape for this movement? If so, then we should see that. There are signs, though, that have one hand shape that differs from the other in a two-handed sign production, and there are rules that dictate what the dominant hand does and what the non-dominant hand does, and dictate which hand is dominant to begin with. So this is something that you will likely be helping your students on, depending on how they are able to produce it in this particular client. You may need to have an interdisciplinary approach and require or request the assistance of your PT, your OT, other folks who are at your disposal. There is no one-to-one comparison in oral languages for this requirement. Now, next on our list is large articulators. When we look at oral languages, of course, we see the lips, and they're quite small. But here we have such a large signing space and capability with what it is that we can produce with our hands and arms. We know that to modify them and to create entire sentences, it takes a bit longer than to utter words out of this small finite room in our mouth, right? Just takes longer to articulate or move our large articulators than it would for these smaller ones in an oral language. Now, if you're working with children who have fine motor concerns and they're unable to render a sign in its standardized citation form, we might need to be mindful of their production as idiosyncratic to them, right? If their palm orientation is correct, but their hand shape is off, it's going to have less of an impact on the intelligibility of their peers and communication partners because of this modality itself. Whereas in an oral language, if there's a fine motor issue, with speech production, that will have an impact on the intelligibility of what it is that I render, simply because of how reliant speech understanding is on the large articulator. It can relieve some of the stress when we understand that within signed languages, again, palm orientation, for example, would have a larger impact than hand shape. Well, maybe we don't need to stress so much about hand shape for this particular child, right? Next on our list is use of space. The first use of space first I should say, that is necessary at all, right? If we are speaking and we lean to one side and then we lean to the other, that doesn't change the meaning of the contents. But in assigned language, in ASL, we have to use space in an intentional way to set up the characters, the subject, the object, the reference points that we'll be using to bring this story to life, right? There are many words that are expressed using space alone, and that space will actually change its meaning. How we use space in the development of more complex sentences also has a grammatical function. Some of you may have noticed that for this presentation, and I do mean this presentation, not the preceding class that we co-taught, Razi, but I have established on the left side of my signing space my reference to oral languages, whereas anytime I talk about signed languages, I'm putting it on the right side of my body. Now, it's inconsequential which one I use, but what does matter is that once I set it, I'm consistent throughout the entire presentation which one I'm referring to. Because if I were to be more flexible in that, it would change your understanding, it would change the intelligibility, it would actually convey the opposite meaning of what it is that I intend to say. Many ASL learners do struggle with that use of space. In fact, you may notice this within your student population, whether ASL is their first, second, or other late learned language, you may notice this as a stumbling block. Razi will give you some of the practical tips and strategies on how you can remediate that and provide therapies targeted to them. In oral languages, we know that we have affect and we can modulate it to indicate tone, emotionality, and other purposes, but it doesn't actually serve a grammatical function. Now, in sign languages, our use of facial grammar does serve a grammatical function and has to be consistent with the rules of the language. Now, what's important for you to remember is that we want to think with our population, hands before face. So when you're working with students, especially young students, for those of you working in early intervention or in preschool settings, at that age, your students and your clients, even if they do come from deaf households where they're exposed to this language in a meaningful way from birth, most of these kids are going to struggle with the coordination between their hands and their facial grammar. That's a feature, a linguistic skill that actually tends to come on board later. If you're working with language deprived students, However, it may be an even bigger challenge for them to understand that coordination does serve a purpose. And you may need to develop some therapies, again, targeted to help the child understand and recognize this is important. It's not just hands that convey our meaning, but our face has to work in concert with our hands in order to have the greatest impact and to get across our point. So this is something you really may need to spend some time on. Now, finally, here, that is specific to sign language, or no, at least the last bit that I will be sharing today, is that to acknowledge that bimodal children, whether or not they're hard of hearing or deaf, may introduce SIMCOM, simultaneous communication, or what we refer to as code blending. For students who are oral only and who become bilingual, they may have these intrusions from their first language that they would borrow from that in, excuse me, not bimodal, my apologies. For oral only children, let's say, whose home language is different than their academic language, you may find that they have lexicalized borrowings from their first language that intrude into the second. And that's okay, that's a normal part of the process in acquisition. It just happens when the brain recognizes, I can't produce two different words in two different languages at the same time, and I know this one, and I'm familiar with this articulation. That is where that comes from. But within sign languages, you can actually produce something on your hands that differs from what is on your mouth. So you may encounter children who use simultaneous communication or sign and speak at the same time, or code blend. Now, with that in mind, there is a difference here that may not be appreciated by everybody. So simultaneous communication, I suspect folks are familiar with, but just for the sake of clarity, it is an attempt. And I'm very clear here when I say an attempt, because it is likely not to be successful, especially in the beginning. But simultaneous communication is an attempt to produce an oral language and a signed language at the same time. What tends to happen, though, and why, again, this is an attempt and why it's not successful, is that the oral language, let's say English, becomes the dominant one that then dictates what is actually produced on the hands. And so the English utterances may sound actually grammatical, but what ends up being rendered visually for the signed language follows English word order and isn't accessible to those understanding ASL as a primary language. Information will be missing, reference, and the use of space, certainly. If simultaneous communication is used effectively, I have only ever seen it work when the English production is very slow, so much so that the prosody is marked and sounds bizarre to any native listener listening. But that is the only way that I have seen SIMCOM be at all close to accessible for those listening in ASL. Now contrast that with code blending, which is where you would have, let's say, one proposition, one idea that the utterer wishes to convey. Part of the message would come from one language and part of the message would come from the other. So you need to know and have access to both to understand the message in its entirety. It's really hard to think of a natural example on the spot here. But for those who study or work with bimodal, bilingual children and populations, you may notice this code blending. I'm trying to think if I have some examples. If I do, I actually will send them to Kim or Laura and ask them to share them with you once they send out the slides as well. So we'll bookmark that for later. Let me pause here, ask any questions so far? All right, great. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to Razi.
Okay. Thank you so much, Leah. That was a great review, an explanation of, taking what we know about spoken language, linguistics, and applying that to signed languages and connecting all of those dots. Yes. Okay. So next, My portion, I will talk about some different options in terms of assessment for deaf children for their ASL skills. So here are a few options that we do have that are designed for age birth to 5. Some of you may already be familiar with some of these assessments, but I will hit on a few of them. First, we have here the VCSL. It is written. It's standardized, as I said, for birth to 5 and specific for ASL users. If you have a child who has been exposed to ASL, some or a significant amount of ASL from birth to 5, this may be a good choice in terms of assessment. It's interesting, as of recent research shows, with this age range for VCSL, it seems to be a great match. And it works and it shows specific skills for this specific age range for ASL. And there's a lot of areas to check off for specific age ranges. But the order of it all is, I would say, not the best. But this specific assessment has a lot of sign modality specific skills to assess. So it can give you a lot of information if you're writing an IEP or IFSP for goals and whatnot, you can use this. The second one on the list here is the Sky High Language Development Scale. And the criterion reference is for ages. It's not standardized, but it is from birth to 5. For this one, actually now in California, with our Lead K bill, for those deaf, hard of hearing children in the K-12 system from 0 to 5, we do require, teachers of the deaf are required to use this Sky High Language Development Scale to garner information about our students to then report to the state. So some of you may be in other states and may have a similar system. I'm not sure if you have that requirement, but this is a language agnostic, which would mean it doesn't have to specifically apply to one specific language, but it does focus on English and ASL. So it does have some areas for both and a little bit of overlap of which language. It doesn't specifically say what they're talking about, but it can apply to either language of what this child has been exposed to. So preschool, elementary, and up, there are some more options you can choose from. The Northern Signs Research, that's receptive and expressive, standardized for age 3 to 14. And this assessment is if you are not fluent in a signed language, you are able to bring in an interpreter to be able to communicate with the child. And you maybe provide this assessment for a receptive type of assessment. Basically, you show the student a video, and the student will then, I believe there are 4 options to pick from after watching the video to answer of what they just watched. So then you can document if they were right or wrong. And then at the end, they have information so you can figure out where their areas of struggle are. Next one here is the ASL Receptive Expressive Skills Test. That's also in Canada. standardized for 4 to 14-year-olds. But people give this assessment because if this person has strong ASL skills, to give a score, or it can be used for the Northern Signs research folks to also give you more information. Possibly if this student is not fluent in ASL, they would be able to give this assessment, have the student recorded, and send this off for further analysis. The third one on here is ASL vocabulary test, standardized for age 6 to 10. And if you want to know more about language first, there is a presentation about using this exact assessment within their library if you wanted to watch that module. But same type of it, where it's a receptive assessment, you score it yourself, then you can send out the expressive recorded portion and they will assess it and send it back to you. So as SLPs, I mean, I'm assuming you all know that we also have English-based assessments that are used. And that could be translated or interpreted into any other language or sign language. And then it's important that you recognize that you can't use that standard scoring after it's been interpreted or translated. If you are using this for supplemental information, that is a good additive. Just make sure that in the report, you make note and draw attention to that this can't be used for standardized scoring because this test has been modified, aka it's been interpreted or translated from English. So there are a few that I think are beneficial for deaf students to take. The first one, the language processing test. I do notice that many of my students, especially those who experience language deprivation, how they think and how they organize information, it's very difficult for them to group and categorize and organize information and come up with exactly what they want to express. So, so this would be a good one, language processing test. This gives a lot of valuable information about the students' processing. Second one here, the test of narrative language. This gives some nice structure to measure narratives, essentially, from students. So you can use those both without a standardized score attached to it. So setting therapy goals. Before we go to the next slide here, I know, and we know that it's vital that these goals are set as SMART goals, S-M-A-R-T, S being specific, M, measurable, A, gosh, I can't remember it. This is from grad school. Oh, achievable. Yes. The R.
Reasonable.
Thank you. Yes. Yes. If I weren't presenting right now.
Realistic, sorry.
Realistic. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. If I weren't presenting right now, I could probably rattle these off, but I'm on the spot. Yes. R, realistic. T, timely, or
Bound. Time
bound. Thank you. All right. So there is a lot going on this slide. There's a lot of information. So I'll give you just a second to look it over and then we'll talk about it. All right, so something that we did talk about in grad school that I can remember, at least for me, that didn't come to light until I was within the school system. I worked with someone who harped on this exact thing, the goal setting flowchart, which very much helped me understand how to figure out goals and incorporate services. So I'm just passing this along, and hopefully this will help you out as well. And maybe you do already have experience with this, working with some teachers or parents when they ask specifically about a student, and they ask, are they going to get speech language therapy? How often? Or will they be put in a specific classroom or a specific program? And you haven't started the assessment process yet. And if you remember that feeling of, okay, well, wait a minute, I don't have an answer for you quite yet, so I can't tell you exactly why or what yet, because you just started assessing the student. So, and this is why. This chart shows that. So we must start with assessment. We must. So we can get a clear picture of this student's strengths, their weaknesses, what their performance is compared to same age peers. And in their current placement, how well are they accessing the curriculum? Because it's important that we are able to compare both at the peer age level and in the current placement, or where we're actually considering to place them, and how well they are able to access the environment and access the content. So upon that assessment, then that will lead you into areas that may need a little bit more clarification or areas of need. Noticing any gaps in their knowledge or skills, which is preventing them to access that current curriculum of where they're at and placed, or are they restricted or have less access in that current placement? Knowing that will then lead you to the goals section. And setting goals should address those gaps in skills from those areas of need, whether that's skills from an early age. For example, many students, I'm noticing, many students are missing skills that should have been acquired at a younger age, but they may have higher level skills from the current age. So there's some type of gap in those early year skills. So it's kind of like a Swiss cheese, just a lot of missing pieces and holes in their learning. So those gaps from those early years, it's significant and important for us to go back and fill those in. And those could be options for goals, or also skills for future needs. And you can think about this in terms of functions. What type of skills does the student currently have, or what will they need if were they to go into a specific placement or use a specific curriculum? Which will lead you to the last part here of services and placement. So we choose those services and that placement based on what this student needs to achieve the goals that we've set. That last one almost, and then we'll move on. So from assessment, we're determining the areas of need, which will then help us establish goals, which then we'll be able to pick the service and placement needed for this student. Okay, so Monday morning, you have a student who comes into your office, or multiple students. You may be working with a small group. I always want to know when I go to workshops, what do you do? I want to leave with tangible, actual ideas that I can use the next day, Monday morning. Yes, tomorrow. That's
Tomorrow.
tomorrow. That's tomorrow. So I'm hoping that I'm achieving that, giving you some actual hands-on things you can use. So before we dive in to this part here, I want to address, I don't know your team specific structure. I don't know where you work or what that looks like. But obviously, I'm going to share some examples, and your structure or your system may look different. Some systems have teachers of the deaf and have ASL related goals. Some are more oral English spoken goals. So whatever your structure may be, that is just fine. Whatever your team has decided, that's great. A different structure that I have seen related with SLPs who are fluent in ASL. Teachers may address more of the top-down approach, classroom-based specific goals, and then the SLPs may start and do the bottom-up approach, kind of honing in on the details of the language and setting goals in that way. So they both work together from the top and bottom to meet the needs of that student and hopefully filling in those gaps from all angles. Another scenario that it could be that is very common for hard of hearing kids who are in a public mainstream school. The teacher of the deaf addresses hearing or like self-advocacy goals and skills, and the SLP would take on all of the speech and language goals. But if you have a student and you as an SLP, if you have a student who is hard of hearing or deaf, and there is no teacher of the deaf within their IEP team, you must have a teacher of the deaf in some sort of way interacting with this student. That means you aren't fully taking on the responsibility of everything for this specific student. Even if the teacher of the deaf is just joining for a one-time consult or whatnot, you still have to have a TOD who has been in contact with this student. That's a whole other discussion with special ed and whatnot, but just an FYI. So for each domain, I've come up with some examples and specific goals you could use. Leah, go ahead and show. Oh, nope, never mind. I guess it's one by one. I won't go into a deep explanation, but you will have access to these slides after. So feel free to read over this and use what you'd like for yourself and modify them to fit the students you work with. Feel free to, please, because obviously I'm not perfect. So if you're looking at this and at this goal and think, oh, gosh, I wouldn't use this for any of my students, that's great. No worries. I'm open to feedback. Please do let me know if anything comes to mind. But in terms of phonology, here's a sample goal. If you notice that a student is struggling with hand shape, location, and other parameters related with phonology, you could set a goal for them to copy or imitate you signing. And you can cover all of the parameters to ensure that they are correct. Yeah. And some other ideas that may be helpful. You can play the handshake game. There's some videos that you can use. CSD, the California School for the Deaf, they have a YouTube channel of some preschool kids here that sign different things with different hand shapes. And they have a wide variety of videos you can choose from showing different hand shapes. As you can see here, she's signing tall, all with this index finger hand shape. Same with books. We have a book here, Rhymes When Signed. It's very cute. It's a great book. A lot of a lot of the kids love playing with it. Where the hand shape is used over and over again and used the same to show rhyming. So on one page it has yellow whale. That's just one example. Or red shrimp, I think, something like that. It's cute. So a goal for morphology. So many students that I work with struggle to show who's doing what to whom. Often the subject is there and the object is missing, or vice versa. So if a student wants to tell a story, you can write a goal for them to storytell with occasional questions from you. Maybe they'll use 3 agreement verbs to clarify and identify who the subject is, what the verb is, and who the object is. And you can use books. Books are great. These mostly because it's very clear of who is doing the action and where and what is happening. Also for locative verbs, if you want to show where something is occurring, you can use a book like this that has pictures and you can point, for example, the apple was on top of people's heads, that type of thing. And what happened to the apple? If the apple fell off, it's very clearly shown right here in the illustrations in the book, and you can show that to the students of what this means, and they can copy you. So goals for syntax. I won't read all of this or go into all of this. You can check these slides out later. But some examples of goals are MLU, as you can see here on the slide. Different
mean length. Yep, mean length of utterance.
Thank you. Yep, MLU, mean length of utterance. So you can also use it to teach different personal pronouns or indicate time concepts. Typically, children who've experienced language deprivation very much struggle with expressing the concept of time and when something happened. So this is a potential way to write a goal for that. Just some ideas. And this, different ideas if you're working on classifiers and use of space. Or if you want to practice using different classifiers, if you're maybe using the F hand shape or the O hand shape. Just different ideas to work on classifiers with students. The final one here, syntax goal again. But students can set up specific locations in space for specific things or people that aren't physically there in that environment. But like Leah had just described, where she set up 2 separate concepts Now I'm trying to remember, I think over here was spoken language. Yes. And then on this side was signed languages. And it's important, once you set those, they do stay. But often with many students, we don't see them doing that. Okay. So more about MLU, mean length of utterance. Some SLPs use a lot of language technologies, different techniques for language techniques. Same techniques that we would use with hearing children. We would also use with deaf children. First point here, expansions. We also have recasts. We'll say that maybe we copy what they have said and then add something. Or set up a specific activity that requires a longer response. Or ask an open-ended question that kind of, I suppose, forces the student to respond with a longer answer, which is the same technique and approach that you use with spoken language children. For spatial context, related with classifiers, many of our children think very concretely and need physical, actual movement of things. But what's important is that you don't just set up an activity where they have a contrast between two spatial options. For example, this is my magic box. I use this all the time. But most of the children, if I give them something, and I say, put this on the box, they immediately put it inside of the box. It's an option that they invented themselves. If I ask the parents, so does your child understand the difference between in and on or under? Often the parents will say, sure, yeah, if I tell them put that on the table over there, the child is able to do so. And I'm like, okay. But maybe you've never said put it in the table, because that's not a reasonable option. So it's important that we set up activities where there are multiple options. So the students actually have to think about what you said. And you could use classifiers to teach that. For example, showing something put underneath. Let's say you had a teddy bear. For example, if you say put the bear like this versus like this, which would be underneath, the language is very visual. It's very clear for them to see where that object needs to go. And then that's how you can leverage ASL in showing how to put objects in specific places. Oh, sorry. Some of our students need that explicit instruction for this type of thing. Not all students. Some students pick this up, but especially if they haven't had that language exposure or they don't come up from a rich ASL environment, then they may need that. I do see a great question in the chat here. And I think that question may need a longer response. So maybe we'll hold that to the Q&A at the end, if we could. I don't want to forget it though. So yeah, remind us at the end there at least.
Yeah, Laura, actually, if you could make note to remind us, just give us that little nudge when we enter into the Q&A. Thank you, Tracy. Razi, you ready for the next slide?
Yes. So when you're working with students on classifiers, YouTube has some really great resources. They have classifier videos. I have 2 here from the California School for the Deaf. There are toddlers. They have a specific channel that is just wonderful to look at. But also videos about using space. There's a program called Hand in Sand. Hands Land. And you can actually buy it on Amazon. It's a show. It's pretty cheap, and kids love watching this. They use rhythm and space to put on a show for children, so highly recommend that. Also, if you have students who struggle with establishing and setting things up in space, you can have 2 physical objects in front of you or a whiteboard and place them in those spaces. For example, if you want to compare a hamburger to a salad, I could actually set up a hamburger or a toy hamburger if we had one, and a salad physically in front of them, and start the conversation by pointing to those objects. Maybe we could ask the students some questions about this object over here. How big is it? What does it taste like? What does it look like? And going back and forth between these 2 objects. And then maybe next time, instead of actually having the toy objects there, I just have a picture on the table. And once you progress through that conversation, you can remove those pictures and still point to those spaces for those objects. I've done this activity with high school students, and I'll use 2 small whiteboards that I have. I have them on my knees, actually, and I'm pointing back and forth to each thing. It's hard to balance whiteboards on my knees, but I've got it. And then I'm able to remove them. And the students pick up on that quite fast. So when it comes to semantics, here are a few goals. Words, right? So if a student needs some practice in describing things, or has a hard time understanding specific aspects about something, some of you may know, the tool called EET, Expansion Expression Tool. If you have a student, they may benefit from that. This goal may be quite fitting for that as well. For example, students need to be able to describe specific categories and the function and the appearance of something. They have to describe the composition, like what type of material, what does it feel like? Is it metal or wood? All of that. They have to describe aspects and parts of it, and then the location. Typically, where is this item found? That type of thing. So you could use a goal like this for your student. I've often used this second bullet point here for preschool or early elementary students who are acquiring vocabulary and they're more stuck on the concrete aspect, but not fully understanding the abstract yet. So if they need to understand certain concepts like opposite pairs or comparing hot, cold, hard, soft, big, small, you could use something like this. just some ideas. So if you are working on vocabulary, you can follow different themes that are going on in the classroom. You don't have to come up with these ideas yourself. I personally don't like to come up with words for students to learn, because if they're learning vocabulary from me and then it's never seen or used again, then it seems kind of useless. But the best is to use vocabulary that they are utilizing in the classroom and incorporate it in your practice. Sorry about this. Yeah, that's an ugly picture of a whiteboard, but it is a real picture of the whiteboard that I use to work with students. But I have found some of the third grade students that I work with, they are learning about states of matter. Solid, liquid, and gas, as you can see there. And the students don't quite understand those concepts. So what we did was list those three and then expanded on them and helped them come up with different examples of what that would be, where would we find them, how can we describe them, what standard within each category. Yeah, Beer did make this list, as you can see. A student came up with it and it was correct. And I was like, yeah, you're right. It does fit in that category. We'll put it up there.
On to the next.
So, as I said, I don't like to just come up with the vocabulary or content myself. I think it's important that the vocabulary comes up within context and that they're using. So I try to use books that they are reading and using in class. You can't always follow suit, but if we do find books that we like, I will frequent them and use them often in therapy. Then I'll just use material that is related with that and put them all together in one bin, essentially. So yeah, some of my favorites here that I have, printables, things that I've laminated and that I've stored and used. Oh, I didn't put it on here, but I found a company called Storytime. Felt. They sell everything, a lot of popular children's books that are in small picture form, like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. There's and it has the Three Bears, and it has Goldilocks, and it has 3 bowls of porridge, the 3 chairs, 3 beds, and has all of that in there. And you can put that all together and keep all of the same story and the same information kind of together in one book box that you can use every year. In this section here, you might use for the older students, maybe make your own dictionary. And this is just a Word doc that you can also make yourself. Just a list of terms. I'm trying to think of a better word for that.
The classical categories? Excuse me, lexical category.
Yeah, lexical category. That'd be a good one. That'd be a better word for that.
Razi, just 2 quick questions. I wanted to make sure. Oh, Laura has already pinged us. Okay, fantastic. We'll get to those. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So for students, there is an empty section there where they can draw a picture of that word. Then we have the definition. Then you have some example and sample sentences. Typically, if we read something together or if we have vocabulary that we're using from the classroom, And after we've talked about discussions and meaning and whatnot, I help students fill out this type of form to give, so they have a definition written down. And then I ask them, I suppose, what picture would help you think of this term? If you saw this picture, you'd immediately be able to come up with this term and go ahead and draw that. I do always, I do tell them to make it simple, not make it too elaborate. And then I help them come up with some example sentences. I like to keep all of these documents in a binder because then we can review that from time to time. That's my favorite type of review activity, is to go back and use what they've drawn. And I asked a student to do this, but this one is my most favorite activity. So I wanted my students to review specific vocabulary words. So I scanned through their binder and I picked a word. And I said, okay, so use this Play-Doh and show me what this term means. It's interesting because before this activity, the word for this was the word scatter. And before this activity, I couldn't even think of multiple meanings for this word. But my two students came up with two meanings for this. First, on the left side, you can see there with the black thing in the middle is a person. And then the orange red things, they had just handed these things out and they were maybe scattering these orange and red items. I just imagined it like flower petals or something like that. The second Play-Doh sculpture here you'll see with very thin green pieces and the balls in the middle. Those are there to represent children and that them gathered around. There's several children doing something. Maybe they're not allowed. They're all huddled together. And on the right, that other formation is a teacher as the children are gathered around, and the teacher is walking toward them. The kids see the teacher and they scatter. So I didn't even think of having multiple meanings or ways to show scatter. So students helped me with that. But by the end of this activity, they both knew the word scatter, and I knew they would not forget what that term meant. And using Play-Doh and adding other sensory stimulation for our students, it helps keep their attention, helps keep their interest. So I did already talk about the language processing assessment, and I think that can be very informative of how we set goals for students, this being one of them. If you have a student who they aren't able to organize a lot of their thoughts, and they have a hard time processing language. And this is hitting more of the 5 broad categories, and then you can break those down into 3 subcategories. And then within those subcategories, you can come up with multiple things within those categories. For example, I have some students you'll realize why I picked a specific goal for this student. I asked the student to tell me as many animals as they could. And at that time, I think this student was 12 years old. So the student thought and came up with cat, fish, giraffe, and that was it. And I was in shock. Yeah. It showed me that lack of being able to retrieve those words. After working on those 5 broad categories, such as animals, then those subcategories, such as domestic pets, stuff like that, and animals that may be within those subcategories, then the student was able to retrieve a lot more fluently and quickly. Same type of concept for this as well. This is an example that we had used during COVID while we were virtual on a Google slide. I would download a lot of pictures of different items, and I would have the student organize these into hot and cold categories. So back to this flow chart. So this is a guide of how you can set up goals from assessment. From the assessment, you're able to identify areas of lack or areas of need, which will then help you set up goals to fill in those areas and prioritize those significant areas, which then leads you to the services and placements that are needed. I think that's the final slide, really.
Okay, I'll leave this slide up for just a moment. So if you're interested in our contact information now, before you get a copy of the slides, you are more than welcome to take that down either for our email address, or if you're a social media person, go ahead and you catch us on any of those different platforms. Again, you will get a copy of these slides, so you needn't jot it all down, but if you so choose, I'll leave it here for just a moment.